Hello everybody and welcome again to the DSLR workshop. I'm your host Steven Zeller, here to teach you all about photography, not a whole lot about gear, and show you how to maximize the power of your digital SLR camera. Alright, this week we've got a pretty cool show for you. Last week we talked about your autofocus modes and your shooting modes as far as continuous shutter release or single shutter release. And I mentioned a couple things about RAW files and JPEGs. And so this week I want to cover the differences between the two, what the advantages and disadvantages of each are, as well as show you a couple little pieces of gear that will help you get those sharp shots that you're looking for. Okay. Before we get started, let me preface that by saying that, you know, we say that gear isn't important, and I say that gear is not important. There's some times that you do have to buy a few things here or there in order to be able to achieve something particular. Okay. And so what we're going to do here is when we have to go down those roads, I'm going to show you ways that you can do it for not a lot of money. Okay, I'm not into spending a ton of money on photography gear. I don't have a ton of money to buy the best gear, the best lenses, all that stuff. And I know that most folks don't either. So I'm going to show you ways that you can do it for very little money, or the least expensive route as possible and still be able to get some quality. Okay. All right, so let's move right into talking about file formats. All right, RAW images are basically a type of image that's captured in the camera, and it's the camera exactly as it sees it. Okay, it's exactly as the sensor sees the scene when you open the shutter. All right, now the advantage of RAW files is it's the highest quality of file that you're going to be able to get out of your camera, bar none. You know, JPEGs are great, but they're compressed. So RAW is going to be the highest quality format. Now, the big advantage of RAW is it gives you the most flexibility in post-production. So when you're working with images on your computer, you get a lot of flexibility as far as making adjustments to exposure, to color, things like that before the image itself starts to degrade. Because if you go too far in post-production, then you start losing some elements, and we'll show you kind of how that works a little later on in the episode. All right, so with that said, one of the disadvantages of RAW is that the files are big. Okay, they're going to take up more space on your memory card. They're going to take up more space on your hard drive. And another disadvantage is a lot of times you got to have some more particular software to be able to handle RAW files. Okay, and it's getting better and better. You can download some free stuff from Adobe to convert RAW files to what's called a DNG format, or a digital negative format, which Adobe's saying that they're going to support for years to come. Cameras use a proprietary RAW file, like Canon cameras call their files a CR2 file, and Nikon calls them NEFs, or NEF. That's the file extension. And Adobe's saying with the DNG files that they're going to be able to support RAW for a long time. Saying, in other words, if you convert your RAW files to DNGs, when you save them 20 years down the road, you're still going to be able to open up those files. Whereas as proprietary software or proprietary files change over the years, they're saying you may not be able to open those up years down the road. So just something to think about as far as RAW files go. Now let's talk about JPEGs. Okay, JPEGs are great because they're a compressed image. They're a lot more efficient because they take up less size. You can use, you can write more of them to your memory card, and they take up less room on your hard drive. Okay, one of the disadvantages of JPEG is they are less flexible in post-production. Okay, and what I mean by that is because of the compression and the smaller amount of data that's in each file, I can't adjust it as much as, say I take a bad shot and I want to try and correct it in Photoshop, and it's the only image that I got and I have to do something with it. I'm going to have less flexibility in post-production. Okay, now a lot of wedding shooters shoot JPEG. And the reason they do that is because they can get a ton of files on a memory card, okay? And they can shoot faster. We'll talk about that in just a second. Sports shooters almost exclusively shoot JPEG. Some will shoot RAW, but a lot of sports shooters shoot JPEG because they've got cameras like the 1D Mark IV from Canon and the Nikon D3S. For example, they shoot around 10 frames a second. And so you can fill up those cards in the buffer very quickly. Well, with JPEG, because it's a smaller file, you can just shoot, and they can shoot 30 shots in a row and not have to worry about filling up their buffer. Okay. The important thing with JPEGs, though, is you have to make sure that your exposure is a lot closer and a lot more accurate than you do with RAW files because of the flexibility in post. All right, and so you can see that there's advantages to each. JPEGs are nice because you can take them right off the camera. You can throw them onto your computer and upload them. Now, the other thing that's tricky about JPEGs is most of the time, the preview that you see on your back of your LCD is going to be what you're going to get. And the reason is because the camera has picture control settings, okay? And I'm going to show you that. This is Nikon's shooting menu where I can manage my picture control and I can set things like color saturation, I can set sharpness, I can use some presets like landscape vivid, and what happens is when I shoot JPEG, the camera applies those to the file itself as well as the preview that shows up on your LCD. Now, the preview that shows up is separate from the actual file. It's a separate little JPEG that goes into the buffer and it shows up on your screen that you see. So if you're shooting RAW files and you're using those picture control settings, you might see something that looks really great on the back of your LCD and then you get it on your computer and it looks a little flat. That's because RAW ignores all of your picture control settings. Takes them and says, that's great, but I'm RAW, so forget about you. And it doesn't apply them to the image. You only will see it on the preview on the back of your screen. Okay? So that's one reason why when you look at images on your computer, coming out of your camera, and you're shooting RAW, you're like, oh wow, this doesn't look anything like it did when I saw it, earlier this morning on my LCD. It looked great. Okay? So that's one of the other things that you have to take into consideration with RAW. And there's another thing that will affect how images look on your screen compared to how they look in camera, but that deals with monitored calibration and especially with prints. You get a print and you go, wow, this doesn't look anything like what it did on my screen. That's monitor calibration, and that's something we can talk about down the road, okay? So given those two file differences, what we're going to do is I'm going to go over to my laptop and show you in my software that I use, Adobe Photoshop Lightroom, what the difference is between processing RAW and JPEG files, and you can kind of see what we're talking about. All right, so go over and we'll check it out on the laptop, and then we'll come right back and we'll talk about a couple of other little accessories to help you get sharp shots. All right? All right, well, here we are in Adobe Photoshop Lightroom, and as I mentioned, we're going to compare a couple of things, differences between RAW files and JPEG files. And in order to do that, I've got them all set up side by side, and what I did is I just took a quick shot of some food, and as you can see here, you can already see a color difference between the two different files. Now the file I have selected here, it's kind of highlighted right here, is a file that I shot as a RAW file. As you can see is the file name, it's a DNG file, so I converted it from a NEF file to DNG upon import, but it's still a RAW file. And then this second file is a JPEG file. Now, in Lightroom, I can look over here and see my exposure. It was at ISO 800 f4 at 1/60th of a second. Now, to my left, that image is also ISO 800 f4 at a 60th of a second. And you can see it was at a zoom length of 135 millimeters. That comes from your camera's EXIF data or metadata that's actually written into each file. All right, so we're looking there, and then I shot a couple of shots that were underexposed and a couple of shots that were overexposed, both at RAW and JPEG of each, so that we could compare the two right here, and you can see what the difference is between the different types of files. All right, so we'll go ahead and look. As you can see, when I bring this image up to 100% in my window here, and I'll make it a little bit bigger so you can see it, everything's neutral, everything's, the colors look fairly natural, and that's a DNG file or a RAW file right out of the camera with just some basic processing settings applied as I imported the file. Now I go to my right, and this is my JPEG file. Okay, so you can see it's a little bit blown out. The colors are really oversaturated because of the vivid color settings in my camera, so on and so forth. All right. Now, I'll move over here. This is my underexposed photos, both my JPEG and then my RAW file that are underexposed. And then there's my overexposed JPEG and my overexposed RAW. So the main thing you can see right now is the color difference between the two. Okay. So we're going to go back to the grid view so we can look at them all side by side. Now, one of the things that I mentioned about RAW files was being able to work with them a little more flexible, or having a little more flexibility in the way that I work with them. So what I'll do is I'm going to take this underexposed image right here, and I'm going to go to my develop module in Lightroom, and we'll talk more about post-production software in another episode, but I just wanted you to see this. All right, so with my RAW file, or I'm sorry, this is my JPEG file, not my RAW file. That's underexposed here. Now, I've got an exposure setting and some brightness and contrast and things, and what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and pull back some of that underexposure and bring it up. Now, this up here on my right, this is called a histogram, and this gives me an idea of where everything's at exposure-wise. The gray is my my grays or midtones, then I have my blue channel, my green channel, my red channel, and my yellow channel. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull my exposure up here, and I underexposed by about a stop, and I come back here to +1 stop of light, and it looks pretty average. Very a lot of contrast there, heavily saturated. Now let me go over here to my RAW file, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to pull the exposure up 1 stop. Okay, still a little bit underexposed, but when you compare the two files, much better. Now I can pull this a little bit more. I pulled that up 2 stops of light, and it still looks really good. I can even zoom in here at 100%. You can see it's a little grainy because it was shot at ISO 800, but overall, not that bad. If I look at my JPEG and zoom in here at 100%, just not all that appealing looking, okay, as far as the photo goes. Now, if I try and bring my JPEG up 2 stops, I went a little far there, but you can see what happens. It looks really bad in comparison. So that's where I said you get more flexibility. Now let's take the overexposed files, for example. Here's a JPEG. Let's say I want to bring the exposure way down on this. Okay, I'll bring it down. Let's bring it down 3 stops. Okay, bring that down 3 stops. See, I've got yellows up here. The color's off. Looks really bad. Now let's go over to my RAW file, and I'm going to bring my exposure way down. Okay, I won't have to come down near as far on my RAW file. But I come down, let's say I come down, well, just 1 stop. 1 stop of light. Look at the difference between the 2 photos. Okay, huge difference. Now I could go ahead and do some other post-processing techniques and make those look a whole lot different. And I could probably fix the color in that, but why? Why would I want to do that? And that's the huge advantage of shooting RAW, is the ability to be able to adjust the photos and have them look a lot more true than what they do. Now, one other note that I'll touch on real quick while I've got you here is the difference between underexposing and overexposing. Okay, when you overexpose, all of the pixel data is still retained in the file, even if you have highlights that are blown out. So, say for example, my overexposed photo here. Let me go back to my develop module, and I'm just going to reset this to what it was imported as, just like this. I'm overexposed, right? And I'm going to do the same thing with my JPEG. I'm going to reset it here. Okay, so that's what they were when they were imported. Overexposed files. Even though these whites are blown out, and I can tell that by using my little highlight warning here where I'm losing detail in my highlights, those are blown out, but all that pixel data is still there. In my underexposed photos, okay, like this one right here, this is my RAW file. I'll go ahead and reset it to what it was when I brought it in. File information is missing, okay? When it detects that there's no information there, it just drops it. And to prove this, I can go to my hard drive where I have my images saved, and let's look at my files. Now, my underexposed RAW file is 6-6.dng. So I'll bring up 6.6dng, okay, and let's look at the file size. 8.4 megs on disk. That's my file size. Now, if I want to look at my overexposed file, which is 6tac5.dng, is the file name. 9.3 meg on disk. So right there is the proof that if you overexpose, you're going to retain more data. Now, where that's going to help you in post-production is being able to recover that overexposed file and still have a good-looking file. In an underexposed file, especially one that's very underexposed, you're going to have a hard time recovering that. All right, so some information to keep in mind. That's why I always say exposed to the right, and by the right, I mean the right of the histogram right here. And most of your cameras have one built in. You can check your owner's manual for how to take a look at that in camera while you're previewing those. But one word of caution is that preview is of the JPEG preview you're seeing, so it gives you an idea. It's not as exact as you're going to be in when you get in here to Lightroom or Photoshop or Aperture or another post-processing program like that. All right, well, I appreciate you sticking around, and we'll head back into the studio and finish up the episode.